Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to Book Trek 2021. This is a 5-month mission I'm embarked on with a bunch of other great booktubers where we're reading Star Trek fiction for the whole rest of the year. We started in August with the original series, all the novels for the original series. Then we went to Star Trek The Next Generation. We're doing these in order of when the shows premiered, not in internal continuity chronology. So the next one we did was Star Trek The Next Generation. That was tremendous fun for me. Because I hadn't liked The Next Generation very much, and now I do. In fact, I've been religiously rewatching The Next Generation from Season 3 to Season 7, and have been impressed. Oh boy, so humiliating, but in a good way. I missed a lot of what was going on. I missed a lot of the subtlety involved. Especially impressed by Patrick Stewart as Jean-Luc Picard. And now we've moved on to Deep Space Nine. A groundbreaking Star Trek show in a lot of ways. You had a black lead actor. The head of the show was a black Starfleet commander who does not have a starship. He's in command of a space station. And it also has a huge preponderance of alien races. It's not a humans-only show at all. There's alien races everywhere. Most of the most charismatic characters, the most memorable characters of the whole 7-year run of the show are not human. And my luck with Deep Space Nine novels has been uneven. Most of the ones that I've read have been terrible. So I thought today for Book Trek 2021 I would read you a little something. You'll pardon the length of it here. We're going to do a little bit of reading. Norman Mailer's The Naked and the Dead, published in 1948 with enormous success of every kind, was the first important, and probably still the best, novel about Americans at war in 1941 to 1945. Mailer at 25 was so thoroughly launched by his first book. It was exactly what people brought up on novels and films about the First World War expected of the New War novelists, that many of his later efforts were disconcerting to his admirers. But even jealous older novelists, Hemingway called the book poor cheese, pretentiously wrapped, understood the book in terms of their own expectations. The moment was still ripe for a novel that would honor war as a test of the literary imagination. Like everyone who has written well about war, Mailer was palpably excited by it. The 1941-1945 war, the war, as we used to call it, was a chance to prove his courage, always a pressing subject with Mailer, and a way of getting away from the Brooklyn Jewishness that he found provincial and uninteresting. War was a chance to meet head-on the endurance, the solidarity, and the suffering that has always been the stuff of epic. "It is well that war is so terrible," Robert E. Lee said at Fredericksburg, "else we would grow too fond of it." Mailer is supposed even to have insisted on his being sent to the Pacific because Europe was such familiar literary territory. Having been interested in aeronautics and engineering at Harvard, he also had a certain vanity about his ability to handle the many technical problems that are created by war. All these personal ambitions for war, his unmistakable delight in its dangers and tests, and his liking for the Texans and the rednecks in his outfit, were the unprecedented power that Americans could summon up for war. Mailer was at once excited by this power and deeply suspicious of its overreaching. He was to write with excitement about the extreme physical exertion of soldiers, the violence done to the living and the dead, his political sense of the possible menace to the world in which so much American power was represented by a figure out of the anti-fascist novels of the 1930s, the sinister, epicene, arrogant General Cummings. This is in The Naked and the Dead. The fascist mentality of General Cummings is a characterization typical of World War II novels produced soon after the war. Mailer's was a generation that had gone to war recognizing it as part of the same social crisis that had produced Hitler. But unlike the progressive, more simple-minded novelists of the immediate post-war period, Mailer saw the general as also a victim of the military machine that absorbs everything, even generals, into itself. At the end of The Naked and the Dead, General Cummings is an intellectual vanity. He has been a prophet of the totalitarian century, becomes a joke on himself. But the liberal professions of his aide, Lieutenant Hearn, are equally shown up when the young officer's efforts to demonstrate solidarity with the enlisted men results in his death. Sergeant Croft, who really runs the platoon, hates Hearn for stepping out of place and tricks the lieutenant into exposing himself to enemy fire. The decisive victory of the American forces invading Anapope Island is secured by the mechanical decision of a staff bureaucrat when the general is away from the island trying to get the Navy's help. These ironies are important items in Mailer's respect for the bludgeoning organization of the military machine. He is not sentimental about the GIs, hard-luck types who were as pathetic in South Boston and San Antonio as they are in the Army. The whole book works for Mailer as a highly organized effort to show war as the ultimate expression of our society. Although his book owes some of its appeal to the shared experiences that so many readers bring to it, the urgently effective quality behind The Naked and the Dead is respect for war as the systematized deployment of technical skills. "You and I, Rinaldi," said Hemingway, the Hemingway hero in That Other Far-Off War, "we've made a separate piece." Nobody in novels about World War II makes a separate piece. Nowadays, we are far removed indeed from the literary detachment of those ambulance volunteers who wrote In Our Time, 1919, and The Enormous Room. Mailer writes as a soldier from the ranks and from hard-won knowledge, both in the field and after the peace, of what World War II did to hammer America into a militarized, bureaucratized superpower. Hemingway, E. E. Cummings, even Dos Passos, in his left days, never saw war as the inevitable extension of our superpower. There are no free agents in Mailer's work. Truly a child of the Second World War, Mailer owes his easy handling of the composite sides of war to his political understanding of American colossus at mid-century. The enlisted men in his novel are always in friction, battling, pushing, swearing, and this personal emotion has not the slightest effect on the actual course of the fighting. What interests Mailer about war is what follows from so much relentless, organized, sanctioned violence. He loves the psychic extremes, the hysteria of soldiers drunkenly stumbling around Japanese corpses looking for souvenirs, and of soldiers in the jungle pushing themselves unconscious with exhaustion. Dread, extreme fatigue, killing and getting killed become forms of intoxication that lift people out of their usual selves, always a prime motive in Mailer. War is still the one big experience that the common man will have in his life. War frees each man to realize his most intimate fantasy before it obliterates him. D.H. Lawrence said of the First World War that it was, quote, sensational delight posing as pious idealism. Mailer, in his first book, still accepts the sensational delight of war. The Naked and the Dead is now a very old-fashioned novel. World War II has turned into a very different war during the 25 years in which we have been forced to think of Hiroshima, Auschwitz, Dresden, the 30 million dead, the threat of universal nuclear destruction. Of this war, as opposed to our restricted image of it during the 1940s, one can say that no individual experience as reported in literature has done justice to it or can. And that the most atrocious individual experiences still seem unreal when we read about them. When the British liberated Belsen in April 15, 1945, they came upon 40,000 sick, starving, and dying prisoners, and more than 10,000 corpses stacked in heaps. Belsen was not the worst Nazi concentration camp, merely the first to be exposed to the world. The London Times correspondent began his dispatch, quote, "It is my duty to describe something beyond the imagination of mankind." This reaction became part of every serious and honest view of World War II, so that, by the 1950s, it blended into so many uncovered horrors, so many possible future wars, such a continuous general ominousness, that the war soon became war anywhere, anytime, war that has never ended. Realism, observation, even one's own experience could no longer express war as it did the war. War as an actuality, bound by space and time, an event that literature could do justice to, has yielded to an apocalyptic sense of the possible destruction of mankind, of the boundlessness of man's enmities. Above all, we have had the sense of a world made totally absurd. War has become the normal, omnipresent condition of daily living, dominating a whole generation by the terror of its own weapons, and by the visible undoing, in its preparations for war, of all those human loyalties and common values in the name of which war used to be fought. The essence of such novels as Joseph Heller's Catch-22 and Kurt Vonnegut's Slaughterhouse-Five, or The Children's Crusade, is that though both are ostensibly about the 1941-1945 war, in which both writers served, they are really about the next war, and thus about a war that will be without limits and without meaning, a war that will end only when no one is alive to fight it. The theme of Catch-22 in particular is total craziness of war, the craziness of all those who submit to it, and the struggle for sanity by one man, Yossarian, who wants just to survive. But how can one construct fictional meaning, narrative logic, out of a system in which virtually everyone but the hero assents to madness and willingly poses as mad? The answer is that Catch-22 is about the hypothesis of a totally insane world, a different subject, for anyone not a Jonathan Swift, Lewis Carroll, Franz Kafka. So Heller, who combines the bitterness of total pacifist with the mocking pseudo-rationality of traditional Jewish humor, has to fetch up one gag after another. Quote, the dead man in Yossarian's tent was simply not easy to live with. Quote, General Driedel was incensed by General Peckham's recent directive requiring all tents in the Mediterranean theater of operations to be pitched along parallel lines with entrances facing back proudly towards Washington Monument. The book proceeds by Yossarians asking sensible, human, logical questions about war, to which the answers are madly inconsequent. Heller himself is the straight man on this lunatic stage, Yossarian the one human being in this farcically anti-human setup. The jokes are variations on the classic Yiddish story of the totally innocent recruit who pokes his head over the trench, discovers that everyone is firing away, and cries out in wonder, one can get killed here. Yet the impressive emotion in Catch-22 is not, quote, black humor, the totally absurd, but horror. Whenever the book veers back to its primal scene, a bombardier's evisceration in the plane being smashed by flak, which is described directly and piteously, we recognize that what makes Catch-22 disturbing is this. The gags are a strained effort to articulate the imminence now of anyone's death by violence. And it is just this that makes it impossible to describe war in traditional literary ways. Despite the running gags, the telltale quality of Catch-22 is that it doesn't move. It can't. The buried alive feeling of being caught in a plane under attack, of seeing one's partner eviscerated, produces total impotence, the feeling of being unable to move, to escape. And this horror-cold immobility is reproduced both in the static, self-conscious distortion of the gags and in the violence of the straight, serious passages. Thus, the urgent emotion in Heller's book is every individual's sense today of being directly in the line of fire, of being trapped, of war not as an affair of groups in which we may escape, but as my and your nemesis. The psychology in Catch-22 is that a man being led forth to execution of a gallows humor in which the rope around one's neck feels all too real. This sense of oneself not as a soldier in a large protective group, but rather as an isolated wretch doomed to die unaccountably, is more and more a feature of literature about World War II. It haunts all fiction by Jewish writers about the war, even novels that do not deal directly with the war, such as Saul Bellows' Mr. Samner's Planet. More and more, every account of the Holocaust turns into one man's war, one man's account of insupportable and inexplicable evil, into the fantasy of a world coming down on the single witnesses who are telling the story. There is no politics in our contemporary war novels, for it is impossible to posit any aim to destruction on such a scale as the 30 million who died in World War II. Destruction was wreaked on Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and Dresden because the weapons were available, because those cities were on the timetable. Kurt Vonnegut's books are haunted by the fact that he was an American prisoner of war in Dresden when the city, in the worst single episode of bombing during the war, was firebombed by the U.S. Army Air Corps. Vonnegut and other Allied prisoners were saved because they were being kept in a powerfully built slaughterhouse. Everything Vonnegut has written about the experience is, quote, true, with the same preposterous irony. After the bombing was over, one of the Americans was tried and shot for stealing a teapot from amidst the rubble. All this has given Slaughterhouse 5 an impishly sentimental humor based on the sheer helplessness, the total ineffectuality of anyone caught up in such a massacre. The novel starts on the pseudo-breezy, bitterly quiescent note of a man who cannot forget the terror, but at the same time cannot put it into a novel. And is not sure that anyone should. This belittling of his book is typical of Vonnegut's many way of fading out on his subjects, of posing as the little man who can never do anything about things. Billy Pilgrim, the little businessman from Indianapolis, who was another prisoner at Dresden, is a figure of entirely unreproachful innocence. He never knows what is happening to him, especially when he's taken off by some of Vonnegut's visual visitors from outer space. Yet he is a solid, good citizen of mid-America, able to succeed in business. Billy in wartime, as a prisoner of war, inspired the German guards to look at him owlishly, to coo calmingly. They never had to deal with Americans before, but they surely understood this general sort of freight. They knew it was essentially a liquid which could be induced to flow slowly towards cooing and light. Vonnegut is always at home with characters who are not with it in our kind of world. People whose total helplessness and inability to explain anything have indeed made them unworldly, extraterrestrial, open to mischief from outer space. Vonnegut's use of space fiction is always too droll for my taste, a boy's fantasy of more rational creatures than ourselves. Just as there is nothing to say about a massacre, so there is nothing to explain or protest. The Tralmafordian, who takes Billy Pilgrim off, explains condescendingly that, quote, Earthlings are the great explainers, explaining why this event is structured as it is, telling others how events may be achieved or avoided. I'm a Tralmafordian, seeing all times as you might see a stretch of the Rocky Mountains. All time is all time. It does not change. It does not lend itself to warnings or explanations. It simply is. Only on Earth is there any talk of free will. In the same spirit, Vonnegut deprecates any attempts to see tragedy that day in the Dresden Massacre. It is simply viewed as too much for all of us, whether to remember, record, or even understand. Noting one horror after another, he likes to say, with arch fatalism, so it goes. Vonnegut is at his best not in Slaughterhouse-Five, but in such satires of the American scene as God Bless You, Mr. Rosewater. In these, his authentic bitterness at the souring of so many American hopes takes on the wildly comic quality natural to him. In Slaughterhouse-Five, he seems, all too understandably, subdued by his material and plays it dumb. The book is short, loose, and somehow helpless. But Vonnegut's total horror of war has endeared him to the young, who find it hard to believe that even World War II had a purpose, and who see themselves as belonging to the universe at large rather than to the country that sends them to fight in Asia. Vonnegut's fixed social idea, especially in Slaughterhouse-Five, is a human vulnerability to too innocent in the face of war to offer any political explanation or protest. Vonnegut's amiable self-deprecation finally becomes a picture of the whole human race. Thus, all evil is eliminated from the war that Hitler started, but that, as Vonnegut says over and over again, certainly made everyone very tough. By now, we are morally perishing of so much toughness, and think longingly of E. E. Cummings' There's a Hell of a Better Universe Next Door. Let's go. The gifted, morbid French novelist Louis Fernand Céline was a fascist, served the Vichy regime, and finally fled to Germany with other French fascists and collaborators. In his remarkable account of being cooped up in Germany, castle to castle, Céline, on the basis of information given to him by the Vichy consul in Dresden, tells us more what the Dresden bombing was like than does Vonnegut, who was there. Why does the American who was there avoid such strong, plain language? Céline's bluntness, his graphic power, incorporates his willingness to take sides, his deep political outrage at the special American tactic of total squashing and frying in phosphorus. Vonnegut's evasion of any realistic description seems typical of the purely moral, unpolitical, widespread American sense of futility about our government having made war in and on Indochina for an entire decade. Vietnam now colors all our thinking about earlier wars. Until Vietnam, Americans did not fully take in that theirs was a permanent war economy, totally bureaucratized for war, prepared to make war endlessly. In retrospect, even the fiction of the separate peace about the First World War, based on aristocratic disdain for politicians and humanist protest against the slaughter of a whole generation, seems more political than those American stories and reports of Vietnam that made a veteran correspondent there, once a hawk, finally say that the war, or wars, has become as unreal and macabre as a bad trip in the East Village. But of course, the Vietnam War is not a bad trip. Our disgust with the interminable killing may no longer be a strong enough emotive to write books with. Still, the disgust is all too understandable. The Vietnam War has been so sickeningly covered by television, by dogged journalists still looking for a, quote, fresh angle on the war, that the serious novelist trying to describe Vietnam finds himself outdone by the manic plenitude of American destructiveness over there. There have been films on TV of American soldiers aboard boats pouring an unceasing fire into the forest as if they were spraying insecticide. The factory method of Americans making war in Asia seems to defeat the most unreconstructed literary imagination. Even so strong and astringent a novel about war in Vietnam as William Eastlake's The Bamboo Bed, and there haven't been many serious novels about Vietnam at all, finally seems to defeat itself. In Eastlake's book, the Americans fight the Vietnamese as Americans once fought the Indians. The book is an indictment of our historic American ferocity and is finally not about Vietnam, but about all of America's wars. As in a nightmare, the Americans in this endless pageant play of war no longer seem to know where they are or whom they are fighting, and the same war takes place over and over again. More than anything else, it is the American bad conscience over Vietnam that robs the bamboo bed of every effective quality but scorn. Eastlake is an excellent novelist, but with such a subject, nobody comes off right. In a novel, everyone is touched with the same guilt, just as the aged forest absorbs and outlasts all the death we pour into it. The death of Captain Clancy, a brave traditional American warrior, represents nothing but his own death, which means, in effect, the end of civilization. A single man's death in Vietnam has become a biological episode important only to his dwindling sensations. Nobody cares, for a dead man frightens us with the reality of our death. Yet meanwhile, in the bamboo bed itself, the real thing, in other words, Vietnam, a helicopter on a search and rescue operation, a lieutenant and a nurse make love 10,000 feet above the battle. The helicopter, on automatic pilot, swoops and rises merrily through the air like a wild bird released. Most important, the bamboo bed is a satire on Hemingway's style and on the Hemingway hero, for Captain Clancy is an old-fashioned American male devoted to the honor of his maleness. But what to do when wars are no longer worthy of us, when we cannot exercise our maleness as true warriors the way Captain Clancy once did? Vietnam is the wrong place and time for those who still believe in war. Captain Clancy experiences total futility at everything in war but dying. No wonder General Westmoreland, the military impresario of Vietnam, anticipates a time when war will be completely automated. And I wanted to read you that. That is the war novel. That was written in 1971 by Alfred Kazin, one of the great exponents of my own profession of literary criticism. And that is a roundup, a literary roundup. It's absolutely toweringly brilliant, so you might lose track of the fact that that is a roundup, a normal type of piece commissioned in the reviewing world, where the reviewer is given a number of books along a similar heading, even if they're novels, war novels in this case, and is asked to write 800, 1,500, 2,200 words on that subject. Roundups are very hard to do. A roundup this brilliant is almost impossible to do. You need a towering genius to do it. But that's what this is. And it was written at the height of American disgust and distaste for the war in Vietnam. And I think you'll agree, looking back on that there's a great, incredibly powerful insight and turn of phrase in virtually every paragraph. So I wanted to read it to you because it's really, really good. And one other reason why I wanted to read it to you, and that is The Curse of Terrac Noir. The reason I wanted to read the war novel by Alfred Kazin to you is because all deep space novels stink. And I'm getting bloody sick of it. Thank you, BookTube.